En esta edición de Ingenious Mind Summit 2021, tenemos el honor de contar con la presencia de Jennifer Brace, nuestra Global Futuring Manager en Ford Motor Company, y también a Damon Riggs, Trend and Futuring Manager de igual forma en Ford Motor Company.
Hello everyone, my name is Damon Riggs. I'm from the Ford Trends and Futuring team, and me and my colleague Jen Brace are going to take you through some thoughts on industry disruption. First, we'll kick it off with some introductions. As I mentioned, I'm Damon. I joined Ford in 2014. I have an engineering background with some experience in marketing and customer research, and I'm into cars, working around the house, and reading nerdy books.
Hi, and I'm Jen Brace. I have spent my whole career at Ford, which has been 18 years. Background working in user experience on Sync, also some time in marketing and user research and mobility before joining the Trends and Futuring team. And in my spare time, I like learning about food and wine. Okay, so let's talk about why there's a Trends and Futuring team at Ford, maybe something you didn't even know existed. So we will be the first ones to tell you the future is not certain, despite the fact that futuring sounds like we might know the future. We actually do not, but we are here to help you think about it anyways. And what we do is we look beyond Ford and its competitors in the industry. And what I mean by that is we look outside of the industry, and we really look to what's happening in the world, what type of steep factors are influencing what's happening in the world. And when I say steep, I mean social, technological, economic, environmental, and political arenas. We like looking there because these are all forces that we cannot control, but we are forced to deal with anyways, that we have to react to and be ready for. And lastly, what we do as a Trends and Futuring team is we look to inspire new ideas. So hopefully some of those will come from our talk today. And as futurists at Ford, we are often playing the role of the polite contrarian. We're often starting to work with teams and saying, but did you consider this? But what if this were to happen? But have you considered a future like this? Of course, we do that in the nicest way possible. We also like to challenge orthodoxies and challenge the status quo. This is perfect when we're talking about disruption, as we are today. And lastly, we often end up leaving teams with more questions than answers as we start to contemplate what might be coming up in the future and how we might have to change the way we work to be prepared. So, as I mentioned, disruption, that is our pillar for today. So we are here to hopefully inspire some thoughts around the topic. One of the things when it comes to disruption that we like to look at is that the SWOT analysis, which stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Thank you, Dave. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats is a tool that we use often, but it is really inwardly focused, and it is making this assumption that we get to own all of those things. We like to think a bit broader than that. We like to look for trends outside of mobility and outside of just our day-to-day industry. And lastly, we like to consider the impossible, or things that you might think would never happen. These become areas that are really ripe for disruption. Okay, and with that, let's jump into our topic for today. Damon, I'll hand it to you.
Yep. So as Jen mentioned, we like to look outside ourselves, outside the industry, and we take this outside-in approach. So we start with the world, kind of consider what the world might look like, and only then do we dive into the marketplace or our industry, and then what happens at the individual level, whether of a company or of a consumer. So with that, let's jump to the world level, the outer ring. And what we're going to start with is population growth. So back in 1973, 3.9 billion people lived in the world. And by 2020, that number jumped to 7.8 billion. So the global population doubled in less than one lifetime. And as we look out further, like into say 2035, we anticipate another billion people will inhabit the earth, and will it be at 8.8 billion people. Now what this means is that it could strain resources, especially food and water. And we know that more and more people are consuming meat as populations come out of poverty. And we know that that beef in particular is really emits a lot of CO2 compared to other sources of protein. But almost more importantly than the CO2 emissions is the water. And you can see here in the next chart that water, beef uses 1,800 gallons of water per pound of meat compared to like chicken or even plant-based sources of protein. And this is important because by 2025, a majority of the world, 2/3 of the world's population is going to face water shortages. And that is actually already happening. So if we look at the next slide, we can see that all over the world, places are experiencing water shortages. This chart's a little bit hard to tell exactly where those cities are, but the areas in dark are having a lot of water stress today. Even in Mexico, there's widespread drought this year, and that's lowering the water levels in a lot of the reservoirs, and which is causing problems for people and agriculture. And even recently, in Cape Town, South Africa, they had the dam levels were extremely low. I think 15% of their typical levels, and they had something called day zero, which means that was the day that people were going to run out of water. And what happened is, as day zero approached, people conserved more and more water, and that pushed day zero out. So it's kind of an interesting real-world test of what would happen as people experience shortages and how they respond, which leads us to our first kind of micro trend that we want to talk about, and we call it the green paradox. So a couple years ago, we asked people around the world, what are they doing to address climate change? And 78% of people, nearly 4 out of 5, said they are taking actions to address climate change. But the paradox comes when we ask them, what are you doing to address climate change? And we found that a majority of people in a lot of countries are only taking initiatives, they're only taking action when it's small, when the inconvenience is small or non-existent. So maybe they're not using plastic straws, maybe they're reusing shopping bags, but they're not doing major things to upend their lives to address climate change. So even though 80% of people say they are addressing climate change, a majority of people are taking small actions, really minor actions. So we'd like to talk about, when we think about disruption, how is this manifesting in the marketplace? So the food industry is attempting to meet this need by basically having people not compromise. So there's companies making plant-based meat alternatives that are very close to traditional meat sources. Other companies are using different types of sources of protein. So there's a company that makes chips out of cricket powder, so actually ground up crickets to add protein to the tortilla chips. And then other companies are actually growing lab meat in a lab. They're actually culturing the meat independent of a farm. And in Singapore right now, you can buy chicken nuggets, which are they're actual chicken protein cells that were grown in a lab that had no animal involved. So it's really pushing the bounds of what technology can do. And likewise, Ford is attempting to address the green paradox by offering really great products that take away a lot of the compromise of going green. So we have, of course, the Mustang Mach-E and the Ford F-150 Lightning, which in a lot of regards are better than their gasoline-powered counterparts, to try to have people be more sustainable without feeling like they're giving anything up.
Thanks, Damon. I'm going to keep going on this idea of population. And this is a chart that we call a population pyramid. And if you look way down at the bottom, this is our youngest cohort. So these are our youngest people. That bottom line is people aged 0 to 4. And then as you go all the way up to the top of the pyramid, these are our oldest people. So at the top, it's over 100. And each of the bars represents the population of the pyramid, or the population size within that pyramid. So as you can see, we call it a pyramid, but it doesn't really look that much like a pyramid. As you see here, we've got kind of older generations being the larger portions of this graph. So what that means is there's more older people than younger. And as we, this is for North America. I'm going to show you a couple other regions. On this one, South America, you see it's maybe a little bit more pyramid shaped, but at the bottom it's still staying pretty narrow there, where you're not seeing larger numbers of youth compared to the older generations. Asia looking fairly similar there. If we get to Europe, they're even more narrow at the bottom, meaning fewer younger generations than older. But then when we look to Africa, you'll see it looks very different. This one definitely does look like a pyramid, where as you go down, you see the numbers get larger. So why do we care about it? What does it mean? This is because we look at something called the elderly dependency ratio. And what that means is the number of workers or people under 65 that are basically feeding into the system to help support those that are retired age, so people over 65. So having more people, of course, to support the older generation means more services and more things available for them. So in a place like Japan, where they are having a lot of elderly people live a long time, and they've are having people having fewer children, having younger youth or fewer youth, they have a 2 workers to 1 person who's retired. So a pretty low dependency there. In the United States, we are at we're doing a little bit better, where we've got 4 workers to every person that would be retired. But if we look to Venezuela, you'll see that there are 8 workers to every person that is retired. And then if we go all the way to Nigeria, we've got 20 workers for each person who is retired. So of course, taking some of that stress off of the system when you've got more people that are able to kind of pay into it to help support the elder generation. And this is a place where we see being ripe for disruption with an aging population. So why do what type of things might impact it? Of course, fertility rates. How many children are people having? What type of services or policies might support or inhibit that? What is the life expectancy? As people live longer and longer, of course, that pyramid gets taller and taller. And last is immigration policy. So how are the borders for people? Are they open or not? If we aren't having a lot of youth growing up, maybe opening immigration policies can bring more people of working age into the country. But we are also interested in what companies are doing about it. And this is where we look at some products that can help to serve this aging population. This being a population we see as continuing to grow, especially as we look at those population pyramids. So in CES this year, there was a lamp that was advertised and that was shown that actually can sense if somebody falls, and it can notify your emergency contact and call for help if it senses that you've fallen down. We're also seeing Samsung showing an assistant robot, so a robot that can help with chores around the house. I think that sounds fantastic. And lastly, what you're seeing there in the last picture is a little kind of robotic AI companion. It's soft and fuzzy, and it's coming out of Japan. And this is the type of thing that we might see that can be this companion for somebody. And it's got some AI capabilities, meaning it would get better and it would react in different ways depending on how you're treating it or how you're reacting to it. And it's the type of thing that we would expect to kind of get better as it learns about you. Okay, so as we keep moving through our 3 rings here, we're going to jump into the marketplace and we're going to bring it in a level. As many of you are well aware, COVID is in full swing, and there's been a lot of talk about what it means for work and what it means for returning to work. So when we did a survey, the U.S. companies with return to work plans, 54% were saying that they were planned to return in office, while 28% were saying they wanted to work from home, and then another 18% were somewhere in the middle, and they were planning some type of a hybrid approach. Interestingly enough, though, when asking people how they felt about working from home and whether their productivity had increased or not, 24% that their productivity had actually improved by working from home, that they became more efficient and able to do more in a day. Only 7% said that it declined. This might be an area that would be beneficial for more offices to enable, especially if people are able to be more productive. As we also look to the future of work, we see some changes potentially coming forward. So the pandemic has caused some shifts in expectations. So pre-pandemic, executives that were willing to hire people that were 100% remote was around 12%. But since the pandemic, that has tripled up to 36% now in terms of executives that want to hire people that are 100% remote. So really kind of shifting the expectations and assumptions on how work needs to get done and how work can be done, giving, of course, workers more flexibility. We also learned through this pandemic that Facebook is now allowing full-time employees to work remote. So we're seeing Silicon Valley is often a leader in policies and being more progressive in the workplace. So we always are curious to see what they're up to. And this is one place where they are saying that employees can work remote full-time. And lastly, in looking at surveys, some believe that the U.S. workforce will be mostly freelance by 2027. So really kind of giving the power to the workers and letting them choose when and where and how they work. In case you're wondering what Ford is doing, we are embracing the hybrid working model that is currently the plan of record as we figure out how to get back in the offices. I know different parts of the world have already started doing this, and we are continuing to embrace that. Okay, other things that we're seeing happening in the workplace. We think that lifelong on-the-job learning is becoming the new norm. So we know that skills kind of become outdated relatively quickly, especially as technology increases and changes expectations. So we, in talking to employers, they plan on offering reskilling. Up to 70% of employees are planning to offer that some upskilling or reskilling of their workforce to ensure that people still have the useful skills to continue to grow. But what's interesting is the kind of acceptance rate that we might expect is not the same across generations, where we've got millennials. So these are the generation that's in the 25 to 40 range. They are 3 times more likely to initiate their own career learning. And what we mean by that is they're looking outside of, they're not expecting it from their employer. They're going and finding ways of learning new skills on their own. They're choosing what and when and how they want to learn those things. Whereas an older generation might expect that to come from their employer. And lastly, we are, again, looking at Silicon Valley. We're seeing companies like Apple and Google that they've stopped requiring degrees for many of their jobs, really kind of bringing into question the value or the need for a 4-year degree, especially if you think about the fact that people are looking to get new skills all the time. It's fair to question if the expectation of a 4-year degree will be the same in the future. Okay, so what else is happening? We also like to talk about artificial intelligence and robots, and are those robots going to replace all of our jobs? This is something you may see in sci-fi movies or talk you may have heard. And we don't necessarily think it's going to replace all the jobs, but there are some things that, that we see that might be better suited for machine learning or artificial intelligence. So what I'm going to show is a couple of columns here. On the left, we've got things that are seen as being safe moving forward, and on the right, things that might be in danger of being replaced by computers or robots. So jobs that are safe are very social when there's a lot of interaction with other people. This is something that's hard for a computer to replicate. Jobs that might be in danger would be something that is asocial, where you're working by yourself and you don't have to have a lot of interaction. We also see creative elements being more difficult to replicate. So people who have roles where they get to be very creative would be seen in the safe zone, while as optimization and efficiency tasks are the type of thing that we might expect a computer to be able to do relatively easily. And lastly, we have things that are unstructured or change all the time, where you have to kind of think on your feet. That's going to be more difficult for a computer to figure out. Whereas things that are very structured, where there's clear rules that can be taught to a machine, those would be in danger. So, but I also want to call out that these jobs are not always at the very bottom of kind of the employment spectrum. They're not always just low-wage jobs. So we would see things that would be safe might be something like a physical therapist or a social worker. While things that might be in danger would be like a truck driver or even a radiologist. So it's not necessarily always just replacing kind of the low end of the workforce, but it could be in the middle or even at the high end. It just really depends on the task and how easy it might be for a machine to learn it. So where are some places that we're seeing some interesting things happen? The picture I'm showing right now, this is a robot in Japan that is restocking a grocery shelf. And the person operating that is the man on the right, who is sitting in a room, not anywhere near this particular robot that's restocking the shelf, but he's able to use virtual reality to control it and do that stocking from anywhere. Of course, opening that kind of gig economy, work from where you want, how you want, when you want. And this bottom picture is, this is an airline that is using robots to clean in between flights. So this is something that we saw come out of COVID, of course, as sanitization became a really key element. Doing this quickly and efficiently was easier using the robots. And at Ford, we certainly are interested in automation too, and it's not always about replacing people's jobs. Sometimes it's about helping them. And what you see here is a man that's wearing an exoskeleton that is helping to kind of lighten the load of the manual job that he's doing and make his work a bit easier. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Damon.
Yeah, thanks for that. So now we're talking about the marketplace. Jen kind of talked about some things that are going in the workplace, but now let's talk about trust, mostly between consumers and organizations. And we know that trust has been decreasing for quite a while. So in one of our surveys that we did recently, it's a little bit old data from 2001 to 2011, but trust in brands decreased by 50%. So a huge drop in trust in brands. And partly this is because people say it's harder for them to believe and trust what companies say and do. So 77% of folks that we surveyed said they find it harder to trust what companies say and do. And if we look even broader to the government, and this is the U.S. government, but trust has been falling for decades. If we just look at a huge institution like the U.S. government, all the way from in the 70s back in 1950s, and then now we're in below 25% here in today. So trust in organizations across the board has been falling for quite a while. But what builds trust with the brand? So in our trend research, we ask consumers what they find trustworthy. And one thing is transparency. So 2/3 of people say if the company is transparent with where it sources its materials, how it treats its employees, how it presents itself in the world, they find that more trustworthy. In addition, people that say that the brand has ethical values and they demonstrate authenticity, they're not being deceitful or going against what they find important. Again, over 60% of people say that is important when they think about brands. Of course, and trust is about treating your employees well. So companies that treat their employees well, people find that really important. And again, almost 2/3 of people say that helps them trust a brand. And finally, it has to stand for something. We call it, companies being called to stand on what their values mean and how they reinforce them. And so people are looking for brands that have values similar to their own and that aligns with them, and that's what helps them trust that company. So again, in the 60% range of people that find that an important thing of a company to do to gain their trust. And how does Ford do this? So Ford does this by improving people's lives. So recently, here in the United States, Texas had some really bad storms that knocked out the power grid, and people were using their F-150s with a power to the box feature to power their homes, and that helps them trust the Ford brand as it helps them get through tough times. During the pandemic, as many of you know, we built personal protective equipment, and of course that helped people trust that we're doing things to help the community at large, not just continue to make cars. And a recent survey found that we're rated in the top when it comes to trust, with Apple, Amazon, and Pfizer as some of the brands that are most trusted in the company. So really, our mantra is improving people's lives will lead them to trust us even more. So that kind of rounds up our middle ring. So now let's move on to the individual level. So the middle of our rings, kind of the bullseye, and let's talk about what are some of the macro trends that could give us some ideas for disruption down to the individual level. So the first one is this idea of information overload. There's a recent study done by Microsoft that found that a goldfish actually has a 9-second attention span, and the average human has about 8 seconds of an attention span. So depending on how they did that study, you could say that we have a shorter attention span than a goldfish. And another kind of shocking statistic was over the last 100 years, it's been found that the average IQ has dropped by 1.6 points. So people have a lower IQ than they did 100 years ago, which seems kind of odd considering the whole information age. And actually, that might be the problem. Back in 1940, the information you would intake on an average day is 1/90th what we do today. So in 2018, people consumed 90 times more information on a daily basis than they did in 1940. And so the thought is that all this information that we're getting through our devices, through screens, through media, it's just kind of overloading our brain and not giving the brain any time to think, which are causing these low attention spans and maybe drops in IQ. So that kind of begs the question, how are people trying to use this for disruption? How are they taking this macro trend and finding opportunities to make people's lives better? So some companies are offering employees naps at work. So these pods that allow you to take a break and let your brain decompress from all this information overload. Other companies are developing products that help you get away from your device. This is a product that you can see here that you can put your phone in there, lock it away for a certain amount of time, and then you can't get to it until that timer counts down. And in one of our recent trend reports, we found that almost 70% of adults say that they should have mandatory timeout from their devices. And even, we've talked quite a bit about Silicon Valley, I guess, but one of the more interesting stories that's come out has been that a lot of executives in Silicon Valley are actually banning their own children from using the technology that they themselves develop, indicating that they may not think it's the greatest idea for a developing mind, and again, kind of keeping those children from getting information overload too early. So that's something to keep in mind as we think of the future. So now if we move to the next section, we're going to jump into health and wellness. So I'll hand it back over to Jen.
Yeah, happy to. So all of these, of course, as we look at the individual level, all are connected to health and wellness. And when we do that, when we talk about it, we mean physical, we mean mental. So all of that gets kind of looked at. And we did a little research in looking at obesity levels in Mexico, where we see that 36% of Mexicans over 20 are obese. It's certainly not leaving you guys alone. That is happening all over the world. And we see that annual healthcare costs associated with that obesity are expected to rise to $272 billion in 2023. So continuing to kind of have to pay more as people are having more and more health problems that are connected to it. And we see that Mexico's GDP will decline by 5.3% due to the obesity epidemic between 2020 and 2050. So as this continues to make it more difficult for people to work because they're having more and more health problems, of course, having a negative impact on the economy. So there's some opportunity, of course, some spaces that are ripe for opportunity there. Another thing that we like to look at is mental health and wellness. So of course, we are humans as a whole package, and it's not always just physical. When it comes to mental health, we in our annual survey, we saw that Gen Z is 2 times more likely to feel lonely on a regular basis than baby boomers. This is particularly interesting as we often think of our elderly generation as being lonely, and we think of our youngest generation as being hyper-connected and kind of always on and always communicating. But when surveyed, they said they were 2 times more likely to be lonely at least 1 time per week than our baby boomers. We also see that 80% of the population will experience a diagnosable mental health issue in their lifetime. This could be something like depression or anxiety. You may have noticed in the news it's becoming much more prevalent for athletes to talk about it, for people to talk about it. It's starting to enter conversations at the work level as well. So we can expect 80% of people to have to deal with something connected to a mental health issue in their lifetime. And when we talk to workers, we see that 91% of workers in the U.S., they want their employers to assist employees with mental health. So we're starting to see workers asking for those types of benefits as the importance of this becomes more and more prominent. And it's well worth the investment. So if a company doesn't necessarily think it's worth it just for the good of their employees, they could look at the bottom line and see that $300 billion is the estimated cost of lost productivity in a year due to untreated mental illness. So people missing work or people being maybe distracted or unable to complete their jobs properly because of these mental illnesses. So if businesses aren't willing to kind of make offerings just based on the health of their employees, maybe looking at it from the bottom line would help to push the needle. Another area connected to this, of course, is Alzheimer's and other diseases that we see that impact mental health. In the U.S., we see that more than 6 million Americans are living with Alzheimer's disease. And we see that there are 16 million family caregivers that care for someone with Alzheimer's or other dementia-related ailments. So we are seeing lots of younger generations, of course, taking care of older generations here as they deal with these illnesses. And we see that 80% of those with Alzheimer's have insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes, really kind of connecting back to the obesity problem that we talked about earlier. And we're seeing, again, kind of the mental and physical health elements really kind of connecting together with some data like that. So where do we look to for solutions? We do see some interesting things happening from the technology world. There are things like lab-grown or 3D printed organs, so trying to identify new ways of making people healthy or giving them the things that they need. There's lots of people that are on waiting lists for organs and whatnot that, of course, would require a donor. But if we're all getting sicker, it's going to be harder and harder to find, healthy donors. In which case, looking to technology and 3D printed organs could be an option in the future. We're also looking to things like the genetic crystal ball, so being able to do simple maybe swab tests or blood tests to understand what's happening from the genetic makeup and understand and maybe get ahead of some of the potential diseases that might be in your future. And blood-based cancer screeners, so trying to kind of identify some health issues earlier and earlier using different technologies and different tests that can help us stay healthy longer. Some other solutions that we see when this one is specific to mental health. So we're seeing a lot of apps really kind of come to the forefront that help with mental illness and make it easier for anybody to get access to a professional when it comes to utilizing just something as simple as an app to connect with a doctor. We're also seeing video games that are now available via prescription for things like attention deficit disorder. This is usually treated with medication, and now we've seen an approved video game that helps children with this disorder. And lastly, if you really want to get ahead of the curve and look at brain-machine interface, we see implants that are being tested right now that are for mood boosting, and this is the type of thing that makes sense whether you're having an episode or starting to get into a bad space, and it uses little electrical pulses to try and get you into a better place. So if you're really feeling like testing the waters, maybe a brain implant is what's next. If you're wondering what Ford has been doing in this space, they are looking to make some improvements. So in the last couple of years, they have updated the parental leave policy from 2 weeks being fully paid all the way up to 8. And this is for maternal and paternal leave as well as adoption. So really trying to allow that time for bonding and that mental break and letting people kind of focus on new things like a new family member, and being able to kind of focus on that. Another thing that we've done with our customers is when a customer buys a Lincoln vehicle, they now get a complimentary 1-year membership to Calm, which is one of those mental health apps that I mentioned earlier. So the type of thing that's supposed to help you center and meditate and things like that. And last year in 2020 was the first Ford Mindfulness Week, where there was an entire week devoted to teaching employees about ways to help be more mindful when it comes to self-care. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about disruption.
Okay, so now we kind of went through a bunch of macro trends at the world level, the marketplace level, and even down to the individual level. And those can help inspire us to think about, what kind of things are we seeing that allow us to consider how to disrupt an industry or a segment. But now we're going to go a little bit further with challenging orthodoxies. So as we mentioned, we talked about looking outside for trends outside of mobility. So that's one area. Look for analogous examples that we can use to come across to come up with ideas. And we're also going to consider the impossible. So things that maybe today you think that will never happen, it's impossible. Why would you even think that? Those are places that are ripe for disruption. So let's first define what an orthodoxy is. So an orthodoxy is really like how we do things, how we've done things, and how we do things around here. And they're not usually written down. They're kind of just in everyone's minds. And it kind of shapes how we behave, because it's just kind of the culture of the group or the culture of the company. And so that's why we kind of get stuck in these orthodoxies, kind of like getting stuck in a rut, because that's just how we've always done things. But what we want to do is we want to challenge these orthodoxies. And why would you want to challenge an orthodoxy? First, you want to unlock the brain, kind of make people open to change, consider what could be changed. Secondly, we want to improve decision making. So sometimes we don't know which way to go, or we don't feel we can make a decision because we just go back to what's always been done. So this is a way to allow people to be open to new decisions. And the third thing is it's identifying new opportunities, which is what we want to talk about in this pillar, is identifying disruption. It allows you to consider something that maybe no one else is considering because they also have a similar orthodoxy. So with that, let's just look at some examples. So the first one is, kind of catalog or online shopping. So back in the day, shoppers went to where the goods are. People go to the store, they go to the market, they buy things in the store or from a merchant because that's where the things are. And when you flip that orthodoxy, when you turn it on its head, having the things come to you. So back in the day, there were catalogs where you could do mail order. And today, of course, we have online shopping where you order online and it gets shipped to you. So really, instead of shoppers going to where the goods are, the goods come to where the shoppers are. So the next one is crowdsourced information. So again, previously, information was stored in books, like an encyclopedia, and it was curated by a certain group, a certain company, and it was sold to people, and they had to buy them and then put them in libraries or their homes. Well, today we have things like Wikipedia, which are crowdsourced and free, and are completely online. So yeah, there we go. And so information, it's really curated by anyone, and it's free to use. So the internet being mostly free for information, that's how we went from encyclopedias to more of online information sources. So now let's maybe talk about something a little bit more physical, 3D printing. So for the longest time, we've used machines to make low volume parts. We take a piece of metal and cut out everything that's not of the part that we want, and it's called reductive manufacturing, the removing of material. And today we have things like 3D printers, which is additive manufacturing. So adding material together to make a low volume part. So kind of flipping that orthodoxy on its head has really changed the world of manufacturing. But it goes on to other things as well. Lodging, as we know that back in the day you would go to a hotel, a motel, maybe a bed and breakfast, depending on what part of the world you're in, and that was run by an innkeeper or someone that's a professional, someone that keeps a hotel professionally. But today we have online platforms that allow anyone to rent out a room in their house to travelers for really any amount of time, and kind of removing this idea that you have to stay in a hotel or a motel when you travel. You can literally stay in people's homes, and it's a completely new idea that is upending the lodging industry, has been for a while. If we go over to, we talk about the auto industry though, even though we said, typically we don't look in the old industry, but there are some really good examples of orthodoxies that have been flipped. Back at the turn of the century, automobiles were handmade, and they took a very long time to make, and they were very expensive because of this, because it just took so many human labor hours to make a vehicle. They weren't available for the masses. But with Henry Ford, really using the moving assembly line to assemble vehicles with the Model T especially, they could be assembled quickly, and they became really affordable, where you may know that the first models were more expensive than later ones. So actually they got cheaper as time went on, which typically doesn't happen today even. But this idea of flipping that orthodoxy of workers going to the vehicle, but having the vehicle come to the worker, has really allowed them to do to decrease the cost and time spent making an automobile. And as we think of transportation, this idea of transportation as a service, for the longest time, taxi cabs were the most prevalent form of individual transportation in a city such as like New York City, and they were hailed, in person. You had to stand on the street and flag one down, and it was driven by a professional driver in a bespoke vehicle that was made just to be a taxi. But now we have apps, of course, that you can book a ride on your phone, and you get into someone's personal car that they own, and they use for things other than just shuttling strangers around. And it's totally upended the idea of the taxi cab, because now anyone can really be a taxi driver with any vehicle available. And you don't even have to be on the street to hail it. You can hail it from anywhere with your phone. So completely flipping that orthodoxy has really disrupted the taxi industry. And again, staying with the transportation industry, the idea of battery electrics. A lot of the early battery electrics were different looking. They did not look like a traditional vehicle. This is an old concept from, I believe, in the 60s that Ford did, and it looks very different from a standard vehicle of that time period. So some of the earlier electric vehicles look different. And now the idea is that, it's okay to have electric vehicles have traditional styling and look like a really highly styled traditional vehicle, because that's what people are accustomed to seeing, and that's what they find appealing. And so don't make the electric vehicle look like a science experiment. Make it look like a traditionally styled vehicle, and that's okay. And if we go even further talking about transportation, we can think about fuels, even the source of energy. And of course, for the last more than 100 years, we've used fossil fuels, petroleum-based fuels to power a lot of the industry and transportation. But now with advancements in technology, we're really looking to things called e-fuels, which can be made from scrubbing carbon dioxide out of the air and getting green hydrogen that's made by electrolysis and water with renewable energy, and combining those to make like a kerosene or a gasoline that's completely carbon neutral, even though it's still a fuel that you burn in an internal combustion engine. That's really turning that orthodoxy on its head, that you don't actually have to use petroleum to make a hydrocarbon-based fuel. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Jen to wrap. But it's really some ideas of how you could flip orthodoxies to find opportunities for disruption.
Perfect. Thanks, Damon. Okay, so we've talked about a lot with you guys today. We went through some of what the futurists do at Ford. We talked, of course, about a bunch of trends that we like to look at and kind of identify inspiration within. And then Damon took you through the orthodoxies, or the places where we've seen kind of the convention flipped and we've seen some industry disruption. So what we want to leave you with now is just some tips to keep in mind when it comes to ways that you can kind of think like a futurist as you're kind of looking for your disruption opportunities moving forward. So first, we want to say look outside for outliers. So we think it's really important to look outside of the traditional automotive or mobility industry. We see lots of inspiration happening in other industries. You can certainly look there and identify opportunities and see what might be an analogous industry and figure out how that might apply, or how you might be able to kind of change it a little bit and have it create some disruption here at Ford. We love to follow trends, of course, but sometimes what is most interesting is identifying the outliers or the novel solutions, things that you might think sound a little bit odd or crazy. Often those become a great place for identifying disruption or identifying opportunity. And lastly, we want you to consider the environment from the outside in. So you notice that we took you through our 3 rings, starting at the world level, again, very high level, working to the marketplace and then the individual. And this is why we start so broad, is because we really want to focus on the areas that you cannot control, because these are parts of the environment that you're going to be forced to react to, that you can't necessarily just create a new product for, but that you might be forced to kind of live within and then find solutions. So if you've thought about it beforehand, then you might already have a solution before the rest of the people have even thought about it. So thinking really big, thinking about the things that we don't necessarily have control over, but still might impact our work and our industry. All right. Also, we are always pushing to challenge the status quo. Since you're here interested in disruption, I'm going to guess this is something that resonates with you. Identifying and challenging orthodoxies like Damon took us through. So these places that are ripe for opportunity, things that maybe when they first came out sounded a little bit crazy. I remember the first time I thought about riding with a stranger. I thought it sounded crazy getting in somebody's car instead of a taxi. And now it's just a pretty normal thing. Look out for people saying, or if you think, oh, that's impossible or that will never happen. These are the types of things that we always like to point out and get people to think about, well, what if it did happen? Or what might have to be true for this to happen? These are ways to kind of think about challenging the status quo, finding opportunities for disruption. And lastly, provoke with questions in a respectful manner. This is where we go back to us being polite contrarians. If people are saying, no, that's crazy, that'll never happen. And if you do want to challenge that, it's probably good to think about it in a way that doesn't necessarily shut down the conversation or turn it off. So with those tips and hopefully with some of the inspiration that you got from the talk today, you are able to go and lead your team to greatness and find some places to disrupt and make us all proud. So we have some time left and we do have some questions that we are going to go through. So I'm just going to pull up some of the questions from our members here. And I'll apologize if I don't pronounce names correctly. We will both do our best, though, to get it right. So the first question I have here is from an Aiden Cortina. And the question is technology the biggest driver of disruption? So good question. I know we talk a ton about technology at the company. It gets, I think it's a word that gets thrown around all the time as the answer to everything. And I would say that there isn't one single thing that would be the biggest driver of disruption. When we talk about things like the STEEP categories, the social, technological, economic, environmental, and political, what we find is it's often hard to separate them. They are often very much intertwined with one another. You can't have one without the other. And I kind of think of technology as that as well. It's often an enabler for things and often becomes, and maybe that's why it becomes such a key element of conversation and focus. But I don't think it's fair to say that that's the single driver of disruption because you can find disruption anywhere. It might be happening socially in the way that people interact with one another. It might be happening politically as we see what's happening there. And of course, if you think about the environment, I think there's a ton of disruption happening globally with the environment right now. But of course, all of those can be aided by technology if you're looking for opportunities or places to disrupt. So the short answer is I don't think that there's any one biggest driver of disruption, but instead I feel like all of these forces kind of come together and work to provide opportunities for disruption.
Okay, and then we have another question from Eliana Gomez. And the question is, should we look outside our industry to be disruptive? So this question came in ahead of time, and hopefully at the end of this presentation, you'll see, yes, we're extremely aligned with that you should look outside our industry to be disruptive. It's a great place to find examples of what other companies are doing or even inspiration for something that we can do that maybe no one's ever even thought about. So of course that's the goal, is to get ahead of our competitors by coming up with something new and by definition be disruptive. So yes, we definitely suggest that you look outside our industry to be disruptive. We have another question from Cassandra Gutierrez. What are the key elements to be successful when being disruptive? And so I think the answer there is solving problems. So as Jen mentioned, we look across the STEEP factors to kind of combine things in the world that we see going on and then looking for ways to solve problems. And what you want to do is, if you can identify a customer group or a segment or somehow a group of people that are being underserved, maybe, or overserved, there's things in the market that aren't meeting their needs, finding those problems to solve, and then identifying that, that's really probably the best way to be disruptive. So again, it goes back to challenging orthodoxies. If we assume that the way the way that we're doing things today is the best way to do it, it's probably not a good place to come from. You want to see, like, how could we serve customers better? What are those problems we can solve? That would help you identify places to be disruptive using things like social trends or technology trends or things going on in the political sphere that you can leverage to help solve problems for those people and therefore be disruptive in our industry.
Great. And the next question we have here is from a Jessica Mayo. How do you know when it's time to innovate? I think this one makes me smile a little bit because I don't think there is a right time or a wrong time to innovate. I think if you're waiting for an invitation or the perfect moment, you're probably too late. I think good innovation comes as spur of the moment. It doesn't necessarily come out of an assignment. It comes out of you constantly thinking about what's next, how do I make things better, where can I make a difference? So I think it's always time to innovate. I think when you see an opportunity or when you have an idea, that's the right time. So I would say don't wait for it to come to you. I would say keep your eyes open, looking for opportunities and identify those and then go after them. And then our last question here is from a Luis Moreno. how to be disruptive in a company that already has everything. This one also made me smile because I guess I would take the thought that I don't think any company out there has everything. Maybe from the outside it looks like there are some companies that are at the top of their game and that they've got it all figured out. But I guarantee that they are struggling with their own issues internally. So I would say don't assume that any company has it all figured out, that they know the answers that maybe you don't. But I think it's easy to be disruptive really in any role and in any job, because it's really about identifying those opportunities, looking for places where there is a problem that you could solve, and then just kind of creating those solutions and getting it out there. I think that's the most important part. And with that, we will close it out, and thank you so much for your time today. If you would like to learn more, you want to see more about the trends that we track and that we talk about, you can go to fordtrends.com. Every year we publish new data that should be thought-provoking, at least that's our hope, and we hope that you look to that for disruption in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.